right, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Chris Feeney. I'm the president of BITS, which is the Technology Policy Division of the Financial Services Roundtable, and we are pleased to have you here and pleased to have three great speakers. We're ardent believers in the confluence of the financial industry and technology firms. It's instrumental in how ideas get incubated, how they get invested in, and really how they get put to use. So we're really thrilled to have these three people and have you all here. Working together, adopting new technologies is something we've done, and it's been pivotal really for multiple generations of people, how they access products, what kind of services and conveniences they take advantage of, how they get access to the financial systems. Today we're going to talk about one of those, and that's blockchain, which is somewhere between emerging and real, and we're going to have that conversation. But it's really a point in time that's remarkable because it has the promise to revolutionize industry. We have three experts, as I mentioned. Thank you all for coming today, and we appreciate having you here and also having them. I'm going to give you a quick bio, but on your seats, if you haven't had a chance to read them, are some bios of all three. So Silvio Micali has excellent background and experience both in industry but certainly academia, has numerous research projects and interests, and has won a series of awards related to those. Toufi Saliba is an investor, has done numerous investments in the blockchain space. He can tell you the number, but it's well north of 10. And he really has a view on, sort of how blockchain is going to come to market. He also co-authored the fully decentralized blockchain protocol with Toda Corp, as you'll see. And then Arajat Das is an accomplished industry veteran and has spent a significant amount of time thinking about blockchain. It's one of his responsibilities, along with machine learning, messaging systems, and also SOA or engineering concepts. So before we get started, Silvio is going to start with a quick presentation, and then we'll go to a series of questions that I'll moderate, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So we are going to leave time for the people in the audience to have a chance to ask their own questions. So Silvio, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to give you a 15-minute tutorial on Algorand. So first of all, we start with shared public ledgers. And as you know, it is a sequence of data organized in blocks, B1, B2, B3, etc. And so what do we want from all these, from this data? First of all, it is readable by all. So it essentially becomes a common knowledge for humanity. Is writable by all, so if you want to write something, it ought to be possible to put it in a block eventually, and then to be tamper-proof for all. So these are blocks chained to one another, nobody can change the content. And it's good for a variety of things. Here I chose them 4 at random. Timestamping, but more generally notarization and storage. Stock settlement, who bought exactly when, did they have the stock that they were selling, with a microsecond transaction, more in general, the ordering of chaos, and say contract signing, the match of a purchase sale and the a buying order, or in general to have a common trusted party, which is something very, very hard to do. And for course, is about money, but I would say it can cure the common cold just as a catch for all, because it can do so many things. So it really is a dream infrastructure. And how to implement it? There is a Bitcoin and derivatives with a proof of work approach that we all know and love, and Algorand is a quite alternative way to achieve such a shared public ledger. So if you're summarizing a Bitcoin, I don't want to bore you with details that you already know. Communication is by gossiping. I send information to my neighbor, who send it to their neighbors, and so on and so forth. And the main idea is to reach eventual consensus via proof of work. And the main assumption is that the honest majority of miners, that the miners have most of the computing power of the miners are in honest hands. So what are technical problems, however? First of all, are cost and fees. So somehow it costs just $2 million a day, almost, to really produce these blocks. And so for us, somebody has to pay for it, because it requires so much electricity and computation. Even electricity alone, these are very big. And they are tantamount to digging for gold. At the end, you have a big hole. Somebody is certainly wasteful of resources, and if that is a limitation. Moreover, these miners, I see them a concentration of power. In a distributed anything, concentration is bad, but concentrating power in exogenous ends, particularly if it is money, you have some money that you want to put in the system, $1 billion. Who is going to be the guarantor? Is some miner somewhere that says, I will promise to publish when it's my turn the transaction that you want. Really? And is a totally orthogonal thing. I don't believe it is a good design. And if you manage to corrupt 5 mining pools, you control the flow of money. That is, to me, is unacceptable. And moreover, it's not a question also concentration of power, but also vulnerability. You know where they are. They have a very low profit margin. If you put them this together, they are easy to corrupt. They have an address and don't make much money. And then the scalability. Somehow, $2 million a day for serving a small community of users. We don't know how many they are because people have multiple keys. So it may be even 100,000 order of. But if we go to 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, a billion users, will it scale? And second of all, there are this ambiguity. There is no finality of payments in Bitcoin. But because of forks, where the blockchain actually then forks and then triforks, and only eventually becomes a little bit, a single chain with time, you see a payment of yours, oh, I've been paid, then the payment disappears, oh, it's back again. So there is enough risk in the financial industry that you don't need to have this other heart palpitation due to these forks. And somehow, to avoid the forks, you have to wait long enough. And therefore, you don't have one block every 10 minutes, but somehow, essentially, the block has to be deep in the chain for you to be reliable on, and you have hours rather than minutes. So that is somehow is a great design. I'm a very great admirer of Nakamoto design, but I think we could do better. And, that's part of life. We should always do better. So here is a different approach, Algorand. And it differs in the sense that you find consensus not eventually, but effortlessly, one by Byzantine agreement. Let me spell it out what it means. What does it mean one by one? The first block everybody knows is right, the Genesis block. Whatever transaction is there, you know for sure. And then you see that favor there, that represents effortlessness. So as the favor falls down, somehow blocks are created, okay? You see there is. And says, what happens to forks? I didn't see any forks here. What happens to proof of work? Well, guess what? There are no forks, and there are no proofs of work. What you have really, from the very beginning, block by block, this chain is elongating in only one way without any ambiguity. All right. So how do we achieve that? By Byzantine agreement. What is a Byzantine agreement? Is a venerated and of 30 years old protocols that say when the majority of the players are honest, guarantee that no matter what values, think of it like a block of these values, different people can have at the beginning, they ended up with the same value at the end. That is good. Moreover, there is a consistency property, which means if we all started with the same block somehow, then we end up with that block. Right? That is, if you put them together, it's a very robust notion of a consensus. So why don't we rush and adopt this 30 years old technology? Because there are challenges. First of all, these protocols are very slow and generate a tremendous amount of communication. And moreover, the number of players has to be known and fixed in advance. Think of it in a permissionless setting. People come in all the time. None of this can possibly work. Okay, nonetheless, I promise it will work. So what is the summary of Algorand? Communication is like in Bitcoin by gossiping. The main idea is message passing Byzantine agreement, and the main assumption is the honest majority of money. So, by the way, that is a little bit novel, if you want, but I think it's worthwhile stressing because I believe it is in the right direction. Because if you put $1 billion, the fact that you put $1 billion, your honesty makes you secure, and the fact that you put more money makes you more secure. So you don't depend on others, the majority of others, right? To keep you. And what are the technical advantages? The computation is trivial. Just a few additional counting, how many type of messages you receive, compare, sign, and verify, nothing to write home about, is really true decentralized. You have a single class of users and no exogenous powers. Then you have finality of payments. Algorand could fork, yes, but what probability? 10 to the minus 18. What is magic about the 10 to the minus 18? that happens to be the number of seconds estimated from the Big Bang to now. So what that means that if you have here one block a second, you'll see a fork once in the age of the universe. I think we can live with that. And the scalability, it actually scales perfectly. The only bottleneck is the speed in which the network can move around a block, which is exactly where you want to be. Because being a system distributed, the block, you don't look it up in some centralized place, you receive it from others. So how fast can you see a block? Well, it depends how much you can travel in the network. And if the network gets speedier, this gets much speedier too. And then there is security, and security against a bad adversary. How bad? Very bad. Okay. And so let me tell you what bad means. And that means that it can corrupt everybody wants in the system up to, but only a third overall. So there ought to be some honest majority after a while. So, but when you say corrupt, it means they become puppet of the corruptor. So they do what the adversary tells them to do. That becomes really extensions of the adversary. And also sees all the good messages, everything. However, the only thing he cannot do is to forge digital signature. But in fact, actually, the digital signature is secure, not even a nation state or an enemy nation state could do. Now, do we need to think about adversaries which are so bad? I think absolutely. Because it's not a question only incentives and positive and what is good for me to join the system. Somebody will want to attack the system. It better be that we are really prepared for the worst, and then we'll be fine. So let me tell you the high-level structure of how Algorand works. Here are, say, 1 billion users, all right, and some of them are bad. You can tell them which ones are bad, and so on and so forth. So what happens at a high level? That somehow one user is selected at random, and that happens to be an honest user. It may not be, right? When you want to prepare a new block is generated, what happens? Some user is selected at random. Assume for now is by magic. Okay, magic wand, one user at random, here it is. What the user does? He prepares a new block. He sees all the new transactions that are not yet in the blockchain, assembles a new block. Once he has the block, or she has the block, propagates the block to the neighbors, so that start gossiping the block. Okay, then what happens? Then 1,000 users are again by magic selected at random. Here are some of them. Because this time for sure you'll catch some bad ones. In fact, you'll catch them in the same proportion in the general population. So some of them are random. And what do? They essentially, this small committee of 1,000, think of it, runs a Byzantine agreement. So to agree on the next block, then they digitally sign the result. Well, the bad guys may refuse to sign, but if you see a block floating in the network, signed by 750 people out of the 1,000 who can prove it to you that are part of the committee, the block can be relied upon immediately. Okay? So one by proposes, one at random. 1,000 people agree on the proposal. It could be that the proposal is bad. If you propose 2 different things, you agree on the empty block, which is always valid. It could happen. But whenever a good proposal is there, you have a new block. Voila. There are going to be a lot of Q&A, and let me handle 3 of them. And he says the first one is the most obvious one. Who selects the committee? Because if nobody presents, let me volunteer for selecting the committee. So the answer is that each committee member secretly selects himself. What does this mean? That means that I run my own lottery, which, however, I cannot cheat. But I can prove to you and to everybody else that I actually fairly won. So I have a winning ticket that I can prove is a winning ticket. And if I do have a winning ticket, then I'm propagating my proof that I belong to, say, to the committee, and I send my message in the Byzantine agreement to reach consensus, right? That's how it works. What is good about this, there is no discussion, right? There is no, we first elect a committee who then elects the block. No, the committee is elected instantaneously because each one of them runs in his own computer a fair lottery, and only the few one of us who win propagate their victory ticket. Well, but then what? You select 1,000 people, then you run the Byzantine agreement. Isn't this very slow? Well, except that I design a new one which is super fast. defined fast. It takes 9 steps. And each step involves, for one of the 1,000 members, to send a single message, and is very short. That's it. So can we send a short message 9 times? I guess so, right, as each one of this committee. Well, but first of all, if you get efficiency by shrinking the committee, and the adversary say you can corrupt, say, 10% of the whole network, surely can corrupt 1,000 people, assuming that the committee is made of 1,000, right? And the answer is, what do we do? Well, because selecting a committee is so easy, I don't select a committee to run the 9 steps of the protocol, but I select a committee for running separately each step of the protocol. Essentially, a committee member speaks only once to give his winning proof and his message, and then you can say this is nonsense because I'm saying, what kind of a conversation can we have if 1,000 of us start speaking, then the adversary sees who they are, corrupts them all, kills them all, say, never mind. Another 1,000 stand up and send the second message. He kills them all, 1,000 of us stand up, and he kills them all too. What kind of intelligent conversation you can have? Turns out that this protocol is designed in such a way that even though there are different people, you don't need the same participant than before. The protocol runs beautifully even though it is done like this. It's a brand new property, good to have. So the guarantees of Algorand in finishing are no forks, no miners, no proof of works, no weight of confirmation, no cost and fees, therefore, and trivial computation, perfect scalability up to the speed of a network, and immediate finality of payments, and great security. And the flexibility, of course, if it works in a permissionless system, certainly can work in a private blockchain. And if it can do a separate currency, certainly can give you a national currency, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that. That is an exciting and different way to look at blockchain. And I think what we're going to try to do today is really explore some of the alternative ways to look at blockchain and some of the things that are sort of most relevant. And Toufi, if you don't mind, I might start with you. You've spoken about how blockchain is really going to bring sort of global prosperity. And it'd be interesting to hear you describe sort of how it's going to facilitate financial inclusion, and your views on that would be great.
Can you guys hear me okay? All right, just to clarify a few things. So the blockchain can be ledger-based blockchain, can be ledgerless blockchain. The protocol that I'm a co-author of, it's called the Toda protocol. It's ledgerless, so it doesn't have a ledger. That's something by design to benefit from distributed computing, which leads me to talk about 2 things: decentralized vs distributed. A lot of folks confuse the two. Decentralized is the way we see it, at least in computer science. It's a security. If you don't have a decentralized system and you have a centralized system, the way to attack it, you just attack that centralized point. In a decentralized system, it makes it much harder to attack that point. So a system that can run decentralized can be much more secure. So that's from decentralized perspective. And when we say decentralized in front of a lot of business folks, sometimes people would think that we're trying to talk about politics or communism or whatnot. It's not. It's a security model. The distributed, when you have distributed computing, then you're able to benefit from a lot of the computing that is happening to run things a little bit more effectively and efficiently, and so on and so forth. So in our view, we haven't seen any ledger-based system that is distributed, with the exception of Algorand has some distributed nature to it. You guys heard of distributed ledger technology? Anyone? So it's not really distributed. It's actually replicated ledger technology. But they call it distributed. I don't know why. It's either that they were misinformed or anyway, we're not here to justify why they're calling it wrongfully, but it's replicated ledger technology. There's some distributed ledger technology that you can see with Algorand. The reason why I'm telling you all of this, it's extremely important to talk about the opportunity of the blockchain and not to see it as a threat. Any opportunity, if you don't do anything about it, it might become a threat. Like imagine you're a telco running in the 90s and then you see the World Wide Web is, taken over and then you decide not to touch it. You just want to continue running your old phone system. Chances are you won't exist in a few years, and chances are if you did that, we probably won't hear about that company today. Um, so yes, it could become a threat, but today we can see phenomenal opportunity. And the reason why we see that is because there are 2.5 billion people on the planet that they have smartphones, but they don't have access to banking. And that number, according to McKinsey, is expected to double in the next 5 years. Not because they're having a lot of babies, it's just because, the smartphone penetration is actually getting to be predominantly across the globe. So imagine 5 billion people with no access to banking. And here we are, about 1.9 billion people that we do have access to banking, we enjoy it and whatnot. We might look at the blockchain and see it as a threat, to see it of, okay, well, how is it going to enhance a certain process or whatnot? That's secondary. There's a much bigger opportunity for the blockchain to actually penetrate and deliver on the promises of the blockchain, which I have not seen any of the 1,000+ blockchains that they're out there that they can. The blockchains that you see out there that they do not deliver on the promises of blockchain, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and whatnot, the scalability is probably 15 transactions per second, maybe 20. That's very little, amount of transactions per second to cover the global economy when you need millions of transactions per second to run. Now, there's some technology that they do it off-chain and whatnot, but what I'm trying to get to here, which is extremely important opportunity for all of us to look at in all seriousness, is how about we can introduce a technology that can enable the 5 billion people towards banking if we accept the notion of no transaction fees. What kind of business would you be running in 5 years if you have access to 5 billion people to give them loans, true financial services, investments, accounts, insurance, mortgages, lease, and all of the stuff to get to prosperity? And I think this is a huge opportunity that we cannot ignore, and we should really take it seriously.
Toufi, let me ask you a question on that. So this is a financial services audience, and we count on cash movement and loans and all kinds of financial instruments. So you just described sort of an open and, I'll say, democratized environment. Is this a threat, do you think, to the financial community, or do you see it?
It's an opportunity for all of us to look at how we can benefit from that and not ignore it and get distracted by some very little benefit of the blockchain of, oh, okay, it's going to enhance something here and there. This is not the opportunity. The opportunity is how we can truly get to have access to the 5 billion people, because if we don't, someone else will. Someone else may not be as nice as we are. We live in a prosperous world. We want to bring this prosperity to the 5 billion people.
Great, thank you. And then for either of you, actually, that kind of access is important, but I'd be interested in some of the use cases you've seen, either related to democratizing the blockchain or, in case of Northern Trust, really a particular market. So I'd love to hear what you're seeing or your views on what some of the use cases might be.
I can start. So, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Can you guys hear okay?
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so, thank you for that question, because, to just tack on to Toufi's point, is that the opportunity is that the pie can become larger. It's not so much that, you look at a specific piece and you think that because of efficiencies, the cost will go down. So the natural tendency is to say that, okay, because costs will go down, our profits will go down. But really the pie expands because the penetration goes up. So in terms of the specific use cases, yes, we have looked at different areas, and we identified private equity as one specific case that we could take, which was practical. and actually take it to production. And that's what we did. Although there are many others that we looked at in the KYC space, know your customer, and a few other things that blockchain could potentially be of use.
Mhm.
But right now, what we thought would be practical and that which we could take to actual production and have a real client on it was private equity, which had certain characteristics like low transaction volume as well as high net worth transactions and intrinsic inefficiencies in the system, which the blockchain could be used to alleviate, which is what we chose.
Great. Are you just curious? Are you thinking of any other use cases right now, or are you really trying to get this launched, which you have, and then sort of working efficiently?
We are looking at many different use cases, but obviously we are focusing a lot of our energies on something that's live, and we got real clients on it. But we are certainly looking at different use cases, and as and when the technology matures, we will start adopting other use cases.
Great, thank you for that. Silvio, how about some things you're seeing?
Well, everybody knows about the transparency that really a blockchain brings about, so I'm not going to dwell in that. I strongly believe in what Toufi said, that the absence of transaction fees are going to enable to enlarge your base of the people to whom you can actually provide services. Because once you bring everybody along, but the fee stays the same, you don't know, you cannot differentiate who can pay the fees or not, and so you ended up working with a restricted base instead. So the other big advantage is somehow all these other smart contracts that they come from a system like this, and even they don't need to be very, very smart to actually be useful.
Correct.
So in particular, if you think about that you can do send any email certified because you have in the blockchain that somebody has received it. Isn't this going to make you sleep tighter at night? Of course. Or if you can actually enter a contract with somebody with the same trust as if you had a common escrow agent that somehow you can to whom you can give both signed contract and then can distribute it around. So this is going to be an amplifier of all the transaction you can do securely.
So I would like to add to that because that is really the key. Because many people are trying to pursue the holy grail of the super smart contract, where you have this really smart contract which can do everything for you, magically deduce legal terms and create something that will just work perfectly. Obviously, the technology isn't there, and if you try to build something like that, it doesn't work very well. But to Silvio's point, you can take smart contracts that do very simple things, which has enormous business value. And we use something like that in our private equity deployment that we have. We've got very simple smart contracts which do certain very simple things with private equity, like permissioning of documents, et cetera, which was not possible to do easily in a traditional system. So if you take something simple, you can still get enormous value for it.
How many people have heard of smart contract? Great. For those that haven't, smart contract, you might think of just a vending machine. That's a very simplified smart contract. Now imagine that on a larger scale. You can do a lot of things with it. If you were to put $1, it gives you juice. If you were to put in 75 cents, it gives you water. And that is smart contract. So it's not that smart yet.
So we're all blockchain experts, I think, which is great. Toufi, question for you, because you have a lot of investments here. I know you have many outside the space and some inside the space. It'd be interesting to see what you're seeing or why you invested maybe in certain areas.
So just to clarify, from investment perspective, we're more startup factory, so we're building those startups. We have about 19 of them today, and we don't have anything outside of that space, so it's all into the blockchain one way or another. The reason for that is because we believe in privacy and security by design, building startups that they have security and privacy by design. And so we use the blockchain for a lot of reasons, such as video conferencing, which is currently being used by a lot of defense folks. You would think a video conferencing cannot use the blockchain. Well, yes, it can, because you're able to ensure that code is is hashed and is put somewhere on the blockchain, so it's authentic and nobody mess around with the code that you're loading in a clientless setting. Clientless setting meaning that you don't have anything installed on either end, which is very powerful for two people to have video session that it's extremely secure, that cannot be intercepted without having anything installed. So that's one example. We have another one that we just launched actually a couple of weeks ago, which is very, very interesting. It's in the health tech, and that's basically prescription drugs. They can be double spent today. So not all of them, 99% of them, people, they get the prescription drug, they just go to the pharmacy, get their prescription, and they're good. But there's that 1%. That 1% that they just take it and then make photocopies and spread it on the street, and it's like now it's illegal drugs on the street and it's hurting a lot of people. So this company, they came to us and they wanted to solve this problem, and we launched them at a hackathon, a blockchain hackathon in Toronto. It's called Health Chain RX, and it solves it flawlessly. We're not saying, you can get 99.99%. No, 100% of the times you're not going to get double spent of that prescription drugs if you use the system. And that gives doctors audit immunity and pharmacies and so on and so forth. So this is using the blockchain in our world. 18 out of the 19 companies, they're kind of similar models where, there's a little problem here and there. We use the blockchain to solve it. One of them is the actual Toda Corp, which has higher potential than all of them combined, multiplied by 10, and it's basically going after the emerging market. So just to put things in perspective.
Right. Great. Thank you for that. I have a follow-on question. When new technologies are entering marketplaces, there's an aspect of industry collaboration that's needed. How's financial services doing in that space? Are we collaborating? Are we having the kinds of dialogues we need? Or is there another industry that you'd say, hey, this really represents what good looks like?
I think the current financial services, we all know they move slow and very careful and whatnot, which is why we have a phenomenal financial system in the world that we live in. They're very careful. But at the same time, when you're actually looking outside of this world, we're currently in discussions with a lot of regulators to educate them that the regulations that you have here may not necessarily, be necessary in places where people, they're just relying on cash. Perhaps we can give them, a better KYC range or whatnot to kind of just get them into the system and so on and so forth, because otherwise they're just using cash and you don't have any information whatsoever. So getting a little bit is better than nothing. The goal is to get them into the banking system that we have and benefit from the financial services that we have. Otherwise, they're excluded. So I feel that financial services, some of them, I won't disclose who, some of them, they already see that as an opportunity and they're already looking, but they're looking not directly under them, they're looking under different layers of investments or whatnot.
Great. So, go ahead. Sure.
If I could add to that, this is one of the considerations that we had when we chose private equity as a use case, because we needed to have the right actors collaborate, and private equity being a relatively smaller set of actors, we were able to get the right actors together, and we were able to collaborate with them to create a viable product, because this collaboration piece is essential to any blockchain solution.
Well, there is, as Toufi said, could be ledgerless, could be ledgered system. But one advantage of the ledger, superimposed perhaps on a ledgerless system, is that allows some degree of collaborations anyway, because your blockchain is actually seen if the ledger is shared by everybody else, and vice versa. So then, therefore, without disclosing secrets, you allow everybody to have a common knowledge of what has been legally done, and that is the first step towards a meaningful collaboration. And again, rather than making sure by very sophisticated protocol about interoperability, intervisibility of the blockchains because essentially is embedded in a single global ledger that does not discuss who has control of putting things there, is a way to achieve, some form of immediate and valuable collaboration without having, the perfection to be the enemy of the good, something that you can achieve immediately.
Great. I have a two-part question, so we'll change it up a little bit. The standards for interoperability, rules of the road, policies, liability protections are all inherent in the markets we serve. Does blockchain need to have this before you can be successful with a private chain, and then the second part with a public chain? That's a trick question, apparently.
So I didn't quite get it. You're saying that do we need to have the rules of liability established before we have
It's really a question of public versus private and how those will evolve
right.
Differently, maybe.
Right. So certainly that question is much harder to answer in the public sphere, right? So that's why there is a natural tendency and for the financial institutions to gravitate more towards a private permission blockchain. And that's exactly what we did. So we did look at different solutions, and we settled on a private permission blockchain where you could limit some of those things that you're talking about. It's probably going to evolve very soon, and I'm sure Toufi and Silvio has an opinion on that. It's going to evolve very soon into where the public blockchains will have the right controls and the right security for people to be able to trust that at that level. But as of now, we did gravitate towards the permission private blockchain.
Right, which is, for those in the audience, consistent with what we've been hearing through most of financial services. But I'd be interested in either of your perspectives on that.
So I spent about 6.5 hours on one sitting with 38 regulators trying to demonstrate how the public blockchain can be used for better privacy in properly designed system. So it kind of takes a while, and I don't want to say that, oh, it took 6.5 hours and only have like a couple of minutes to take my word for it, but I can say a few things to kind of get you to have that certainty. So one of the elements that the blockchain technology uses is called a hash function, which is a one-way function of taking any content and putting it in, let's say, 64 random characters. You may want to think about it that way. But every single time you take that content, it gives you those exact 64 characters. But it doesn't go the other way. So if you have those 64 characters, it doesn't matter if you have like quantum computers, whatnot. It's just not going to go that way, especially if it's done properly. So imagine a public blockchain more like you're writing on a piece of rock and you're sending it into space, and after a month or two it comes back, and then those 64 characters are written on that piece of rock, and you can prove to everybody that it was sent on April 30th, and therefore you had that document then. So you can prove that, but no one else can. So from privacy perspective, you're still protecting your own privacy or giving it more to the actual users. Now, if that is a private blockchain, God knows what kind of ship you sent it, or whether did you really send it to space, or did you actually make it up, or did you just wrote it on a stone today and pretended that you wrote it like 30 or 60 days ago. So from that perspective, we have to kind of trust you, or trust the people that they're running that private blockchain. And that trust sometimes can be broken. Imagine you send that exact same system to an area where it's corrupt or whatnot. Even if you don't send it to an area that is corrupt, if one of your people that working for your company, they go to an area in the world that is corrupt, and what happens if they kidnap that person and say, like, we will not release that person alive unless you change that specific thing. Now, having a private blockchain, you can change it, but if it's public, you cannot. So from security perspective, privacy, and so on and so forth, it's a lot better to have a public blockchain if it's properly designed than private.
Yeah, but just to give you a counterpoint to that, the private blockchains can also be designed in a way that the actors that participate in it are diverse. So it's not like that a private blockchain has got only one actor. It's not like, for example, Northern Trust is the only actor in that private blockchain. The private blockchain will consist of independent actors. So it's like a subset of a public blockchain. So one single actor, maybe someone kidnapped one of our employees, and they said, you have to go change the hash key, otherwise we won't release him. We can't do that because there are other parties in that private blockchain. So every actor that's relevant to the system and relevant to the environment is part of that blockchain.
True, but in the event of, like, if they just kidnap one person, you might necessarily do a lot, but apparently if there's a a much bigger thing than people would want to react if it, especially if we bring it to the news or whatnot. Just imagine, hypothetically speaking, I'm not saying that like people are going to get that from Northern. Just if that event were to happen, then that pressure will go into all the others, and then they will end up being forced to do something. So that power that you have in a private blockchain will end up working against you. If you were to use the public blockchain, it becomes like the internet. What, are you going to shut the internet, or are you going to stop the sun from rising tomorrow? No, you cannot. It's just going to rise every morning. You can put your people in a dungeon, but you're not going to be able to stop this sun from rising every morning. And that's the idea of a public blockchain versus private, because the private, that power that you have will be used against you, and that's our fear from a cryptography perspective and decentralization. We're not really trying to give that advice because we prefer public versus private because we like the name better. Just truly, it's a more secure system to you, to benefit you and your company.
So if I may add to this, I believe that there is no question in my mind that the security of a public blockchain is superior to that of the private one. And moreover, let's remember that there is another type of security, not only for privacy, but also the security from lawsuits. Because you are sued in a democracy like the one we live, no matter what, if you've done everything properly. No, that's a democratic right. Anybody can sue anybody else. And when you start suing, then your private blockchain is in the way. Because then you have to convince a judge and a jury that nobody could subvert that. When instead in a public blockchain, your job is done. Because you don't have any power to subvert anything, and nobody has any power. The analogy that you have to think about a public key signature versus an authorization because you and I share a password, right? And say, oh, this user, it was you who moved the money around from this account. Because to move the money around, you need to have a secret password, and only you know your own secret password. And says, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, but my password has to be authenticated by somebody. Yes, but our server. But then it is two of us who know my password, me and you, the server. So then you have to demonstrate to a jury and a server that it was not the server who actually made the transaction instead of you. So with public signatures that are actually taking over the world in this way, the responsibility for authorizing a transaction is only with you. The server cannot impersonate you. Right? Isn't this much better? Obviously. Well, the difference between public and private blockchain is the same. By analogy, you can say that you are only responsible for your own action, and nobody else can hold you accountable for things you have not done. That is a very big advantage. I must agree, however, that sometimes when the scalability of blockchain forces you to put power in a few hands because otherwise it would not scale, then you are forced to do it. But once you have a system that scales, and scalability is not in the problem, vetting the users so that you know that they cannot do damage, if you can actually prove that they cannot do any damage at all, then you're better off with a public. Nonetheless, it is going to be a process. And I'm sure that you'll be very happy to move everything in a public blockchain when the time arrives, because nobody wants the time arrives. So that is, we'll end up in the same place. The question is to make sure that what is the right goal towards which we are moving. First, establish a blockchain either way, whatever makes you comfortable, because it's a good technology. But I think the true benefits are going to be harvested when we move to a public blockchain.
It's a spectrum. So the one end of the extreme is if you're one single person with his own blockchain, which is not very secure. The other end of the spectrum is that everybody in the world participates, is infinitely secure because everybody participates. There's something in the middle, and right now we are in that middle space where we have enough actors that we trust as part of the private blockchain that we consider it to be secure enough, because there's no one actor that can go and compromise the system.
I think it's a phenomenal step. I mean, closer to, rather than not having anything at all or having just a centralized system, because centralized system can be extremely dangerous. So much closer step. But I think in security, which is something that we use, it's like you're as good as your weakest link. And in blockchain, we say you're as good as like your centralized point. So it's from that perspective we keep trying to repeat the same thing over and over, just to make sure that to empower folks like Arijit when they're talking to their company to feel like, hey, we're suggesting something is more secure and not less, and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you for that. So a follow-on, but a little bit different, is we have a need to know our client here in this industry. It's critical to how we service them, how we understand what the right investments are, for instance. How do you view? We just had digital identities described a little bit and the benefits, if you will, of the private and public. But how do you think about the know your client aspect and how you really follow a client through their financial, I'll say life, but really transactions? Do you see any benefit to the blockchain in both identifying but then understanding who they are and what they're doing?
Is this something that you would like to take first? Or just
I
okay,
can
'cause I think you
kick it
guys are
off.
working a lot on the KYC. I'd like to take it.
I'll kick it off. But to answer your question, yes, we do think that there is potential. There's nothing that we know of that's real yet in terms of in production. But conceptually, we feel that that is a space where the blockchain provides a lot of promise because if you think about it, the blockchain provides you a way to have data recorded and shared between participants in a manner that's immutable and indisputable. And that's what KYC really is. We are trying to understand the data about you in an immutable and indisputable manner, which can be easily shared between different relevant participants. So conceptually, at a macro level, we think that has a tremendous opportunity. The barriers here are I believe, this is my personal opinion, that it is less technical than non-technical, because for this to be successful, you need all the relevant parties to participate in it. Things like people who can endorse your passports or who can endorse your driver's license, the state governments. They all need to participate in this whole ecosystem for this thing to be valuable. I think that participation and collaboration is what's going to be challenging rather than the technology. The technology is kind of already there. I mean, you could relatively easily build some simple smart contracts that can do the KYC piece. It's getting everybody together and collaborating that's the challenge.
Yep, I think this is a phenomenal, thank you, explanation from that perspective, because it's less of technical, and the blockchain doesn't magically get the KYC. It actually needs the KYC to get to areas in the world that we don't have access to because of the current regulations. So if we were to take, if your company were to, let's say, enable, let's say, our company to go after areas in the world, then you would need to ensure that it's KYC compliant and so on and so forth. So what's being worked on today is lowering that bar of KYC just to get the entry into the system for smaller amounts or whatnot, just to get people on board for a period of 6 months or a year or whatnot, so then it's still compliant with what you're trying to get to. Because at the end of the day, there's a reason why the KYC was written. It wasn't sent from the gods and said, like, you gotta do it. It was written by us, a human, so we can certainly update it to us, a human, as well, and make it more inclusive and not exclusive. It was not meant to be exclusive, but it turns out to keep creating that bigger barrier of entry into the system. But we don't want that. We did not intend that, so we can certainly work around it to, make it a little bit more palatable for the rest of the world.
Exactly.
So certainly, know your customer very much equates to have a walled garden in which you have your customers free to move around between the walls. And guess what? So you're going to benefit from attracting customers, having customers outside your perimeter. No matter how large you may have, the world is a much better place, much bigger place. And so what happens when you want to transact with somebody else? Somebody else has to vouch for that customer. So that is already more friction, right? It's like whenever you want to do a wire transfer, by analogy, right? So to say, does the sending bank has the money? Then the receiving bank has to make sure the sending bank vouches for it. And then later, a transaction happens. If you can somehow, in a global blockchain, you don't need to trust anybody. You can directly serve a lot more people, a lot more efficiently and better. By the way, I must say that from that point of view, however, the fact that a key well behaves is different than having a person well behaved, because I'm not sure that I want to have my data shared by everybody, but as a key, that I'm a trustworthy key that pays its own debts that moves on. That is attractive. That's all we need to know. And from a perspective as a customer, that's all I want to reveal, right? That Silvio Micali, as endorsed by the public key, is actually acting properly, and therefore deserves credit or whatever not. So I believe that somehow know your customer is a noble goal, but I think it can be blended with some privacy of the customer, and moreover, it can actually, through a blockchain, allow you to trust many more people that you could possibly trust before.
Let me ask you a question that's somewhat aligned because it's leading in with the know your customer piece. But what do you think the regulators could be doing to help spur either development or innovation? And Toufi, you mentioned you're in the room with 38 of them.
I think they're kind of all taking the back seat and waiting for someone else to do something, and not a single regulator is really being super proactive, mainly because they feel like it's kind of like they don't have to until something happens, and they all need to, and they get to be forced. And I'm hoping that nothing really happens, but if you look at the actual cryptocurrencies in the last 3 months, it tripled in value and quadrupled over the last 4 years. So it's getting to be big enough to be significant to start getting the attention to folks. I mean, when I spoke at FinTech Canada in February, I presented it was 0.002% penetration globally, which is the entire blockchain. So it's like very, very tiny. So as much as people, they try to make it seem this is like the World Wide Web, we don't see it that way. This is more like FTP. The World Wide Web is yet to happen. But when it does happen, we want to make sure that we are very well prepared from regulatory perspective, and all, at least put in some regulations, some boundaries, rather than saying that we reserve the right, because this is what regulators dissent. We reserve the right to regulate this at some point in the future with some retroactive, but that says that just don't do anything. Just like wait until that event happens, unless you want to take some legal risk. Nobody wants to take legal risk, at least not people that I know. We can take a lot of financial risk and take a lot of technology risk, but legal risk, nobody wants to do that. So I think it would be nice if the regulators, they do something from that perspective. Otherwise, it's just that business is going to go away from here. We want it to stay here. We want not necessarily stay here in a way that it's like, oh, we want it for us and not for the others. But we live in a prosperous world. We want to educate the rest of the world to be prosperous and not lose that opportunity, so that we can have two worlds. That's what keeps me up at night.
Interesting. Anyone else, sir? So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up, or a series of questions. So cryptocurrencies are used in several countries, maybe in developing nations, maybe not at this point. Do you think they'll ever become sort of commonplace, if you will, in the U.S. or Europe, or in more of the prosperous world, as you said?
Absolutely, but they won't start here. A lot of folks, they start by demonstrating how Bitcoin is going to bring down and destroy your banks, whatnot. That's talk, okay? We don't stand behind that talk. Well, at least a lot of the people that I know in cryptography and whatnot, this is not what we stand for. We're in it for the science, for the less friction, for more security, and so on and so forth. We're here for opportunities, and I think in our world we start using cryptocurrency after the fact that the emerging market will start using it. I'm happy using my credit card, and most of you are. If your credit card will start integrating into your phone, that's even better, and it's probably already doing that, and tap and pay and all of the stuff. If you end up paying 2.5% transaction fee indirectly, you're fine with that, okay? That's an average of $450 per year for each and every one of you, and me, and all of us. But that model, if you were to replicate that exact same model for the emerging market, the math won't work in a GDP countries where $2,000 per year. That's quarter their salary. So I truly see the cryptocurrency would make it in emerging market, but the true cryptocurrencies and none of the ones that you see out there. If it's going to be Bitcoin, it's going to be an evolution of Bitcoin. If Bitcoin, they utilize Algorand or Toda or combination, then it would get there. But the current protocols of cryptocurrency that is out there, it's just a hype. It's speculators game. So please do not judge the cryptocurrency for what's out there, because it does not deliver on the promises of blockchains.
Great.
So I must say that I agree with Toufi on this, and I want to reiterate the point. that somehow, like in a building, like I used to have, at MIT, the latest group who renovated the floor had the best floor, right? And then a few years later, somebody else had the best floor. So whoever gets an infrastructure, the latest infrastructure, has the best infrastructure. And here there is the possibility that actually is going to be a reality with the right combination of technologies that developing countries that do not have a very advanced financial system are going to end up having the best financial system. Because let's not forget, which is going to be very good for us, because to see what we can be done, and then actually to try to emulate and even do better. Because at the end, Visa does not enable smart contracts. Okay, so that is only a pure payment system, and only with some certain limitations of speed. Never mind that we can afford the $450 annually. But the smart contract is something that we don't have. If I want to send an email to you so that you can read it if and only if I have a receipt you read it, Visa, how can Visa help? But a blockchain with a proper backing infrastructure can allow to do that. So you get a much better service. So I think here the opportunities, that's very exciting for me to see that actually the developing world is going to get the right infrastructure first, and that is going to be a big boost and try to erase a lot of inequalities that are currently around.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, there might be that leapfrog effect that we also saw in mobile phones, because the mobile phones, kind of the developing world didn't have any real, landline phones for a large percentage of their population, and the mobile phones came and sort of leapfrogged it, and they had phenomenal technology. We might see the same thing with blockchains.
Interesting. All right, I wanted to take a few questions from the floor. We have about 15 or so minutes left, and we'd love to get those. And I don't know if we had any online either. So why don't I open it up to the floor, see if anyone has a question. We have a couple of mics here, and because of it's a live cast, if you could wait for the mic, that would be fantastic.
So you mentioned we need action by the regulators, and I've actually this is Samantha Pelosi with BEFT. I've met with several regulators in Europe and here, and they want to know, what do we need of them? So you mentioned legal risk, and so what do we need of them? Do we need them to say a smart contract, it has legal value, that the assets that are on a blockchain have actual value? We need them to recognize this, or the courts to recognize this, or to have it in some of the legislation?
Yes to those, and I would add, for example, lowering the KYC entry for areas that they are out of this world, for folks that they are unbanked. Our argument is that those guys are just using cash today, so you don't have any access to them whatsoever, giving them the ability to have small transactions of some kind. Let's say it's limited to $200 a month, at least, to get them on that boat, and that they would have a much lower KYC. Like, I just want to be able to give that person who just has access to banking and call them a customer without necessarily having a name. I want to have that ability, because if we don't have this ability, we're not going to be able to get to know them. So if you want to know our customers, let's welcome them first into our world and get to know them. And that's the idea, that the regulators would probably make it a lot easier to put in those ranges and say, it's like, it's okay to do this if you're open to certain areas in the world. Other areas would be around how privacy is maintained, at least if they put in some sort of regulations around that. Yes, you can use the public ledger if you do certain this and that to protect people's privacy. Then we know how to walk around those boundaries, be like, okay, they're giving us some sort of settings that it's legal to go by what they're saying. But by not doing anything at all, not knowing what you're going to end up facing in the future, it's very risky to even attract some of the top talent to work with you and some of the best investors and all of this. Thirdly, I would say a lot of movements in ICOs, and the current cryptocurrencies today, it's $52 billion. That's how much money is in the cryptocurrency. So it's growing. It was 0.002%, now 0.005%. But still, that $52 billion is a lot of money. If you compare that to how much venture capital is invested every year, that's exactly $50 billion. So you now have the exact same amount as much as all venture capital that is invested globally. And I think regulators should probably get in there and say, like, yes, you can use it in those boundaries rather than just leave it open and get some folks to, feel that they might be doing something that it's illegal. Thank you.
Other questions? Oh, we have a couple. Thank you.
This is sort of a fuzzball question, but to what extent is blockchain evolutionary as opposed to revolutionary, or a difference in kind as opposed to a difference in degree? And are there specific factors that will determine which is the right answer to that question?
I would think it's the evolutionary state of the financial industry got it to be revolutionary, because we haven't seen anything that revolutionary in the financial system in the last 30 or 40 years. If you go to your banks, they still use like very old ledger system and whatnot. And to quote Mark Andreessen, he's been expecting the day to come as if he's waiting for the Messiah. He's quite funny the way he says it, but it's basically that disruptive technology is expected to be revolutionary in fintech over the next 5 years, and he kind of said that about 5 years ago, and a lot of folks would agree with him on that. So I think the evolutionary nature of us to get to the point where we continue to evolve at any different aspects in life, but we feel that in fintech we're still reliant on a very, very old technology. It's about to be revolutionary. So.
Well, it's in a sense that is maybe a bit cute. Let me argue it is both. So by going, however, provided that we go back a long time back in Wall Street, there was a wall that ends Wall Street, and there was a tree under Wall Street where the traders somehow were a group, decided to, by raise of hands, I buy, I sell, and it was common knowledge among them what happened. That was an instantaneous common knowledge system, and it worked because it was so small and so localized, and everybody convened under the same tree. The moment in which it expands, it becomes regional basis, national basis, international, then suddenly you cannot do that. So in some sense, what the blockchain properly constructed, backed by proper platform like the one Toufi and I are arguing about, essentially brings back the old Wall Street to enlarge it to the planet. Because somehow by reaching consensus or whatever has happened so quickly, is like if you are present 1 billion people under the same tree. So in some sense, we go back to the old model, which worked very nicely because everybody knew what was going on, and we are actually replicated, but at a planetary level. In that sense, is however revolutionary.
So if I may add that, yeah, I agree. So I think it's going to be both, but it's going to start by being evolutionary at the edges. And the analogy I would draw is with mobile banking. If you recall, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago or 12 years ago, mobile banking was launched on those flip phones, and Wells Fargo launched with Sprint. You could open your flip phone and look at your account balance, but it didn't really take off. It was like little audiences here and there that used it. It was kind of evolutionary around the edges. Then smartphones evolved, and there was an inflection point, and then it became revolutionary. I think blockchain will follow a similar trajectory. It's going to be evolutionary at the edges, and there will come a point where there will be enough players and the technology with the advent of things like Algorand, etc., will come to a point where there will be a sudden inflection, and then it's going to be revolutionary.
Great. Thank you for that. We had another question.
Hi, Tommy Leander with Congressman David Schweikert's office. And to pivot back to the question up front about the regulators or legislators in our case's role, about 1.5 years ago, we drafted a ton of blockchain legislation, 5 separate bills, sat on them intentionally because we didn't think federal action was needed here, but have about 3 weeks ago worked with our governor in the state of Arizona and passed legislation doing kind of redundant work, saying smart contracts are going to be honored here. You can utilize blockchain technology, and it's going to be treated under the under the state's laws as valid. And then today, Nevada's, though, talking about doing something similar with different language. Luckily not counter to the definition entered in Arizona, but not the same. And our question, being a libertarian and conservative office, not going for preemption a lot of the time, at what point do enough states start developing this patchwork regulatory framework that it becomes a hindrance to this space overall?
I think it's very hard to answer this question to see if it's actually going to impact the current world we live in versus the emerging market, because I haven't really seen anything that it's addressing the emerging market. All I've seen is like blockchain regulations work. It's around the work that we have here, which I would agree with you. It becomes like much more hindrance on something that could become great if we let it grow in some areas. I think the intent of us asking for regulating, it's not to get to that point. It's more to get to. And thank you for that point. This is a very, very interesting point. It's more to get to some sort of boundaries, so we're able to tell folks that we're working with that we are working within those boundaries, and those boundaries we're hoping that they're a little bit more than what we can do with the existing system. Because if they're going to be a subset of that, then there's just not there is an unfair advantage to the old system versus the new system that it's supposed to be better. So imagine it's okay if you do that with fiat, but you cannot do that with crypto. Then it becomes very hard for crypto folks to flourish and get to be very well adopted. And if that ends up happening, I can tell you with certainty that the blockchain is going to happen one way or another, but we will end up missing the opportunity to kind of partake in that revolution. So I hope that won't go that far.
So actually, I want to make a different point that regulation can actually be good. So at the very end, the most important engine for economic growth is our legal system. The courts, at the end, that allows us to transact in peace, knowing that there is a recourse, if anything else. And without the courts, that's what makes us actually very prosperous as a nation. So I actually welcome regulation. The important thing is that it's informed, knowledgeable regulation. In other words, we don't want to, by regulating the old system, pre-blockchain, otherwise we are not taking advantage, nor do we want to regulate Bitcoin as it is and derivatives, because if we try to regulate this, we are regulating by now a dinosaur, because somehow we are moving on to different platforms with different stories. So the important thing is that I would welcome regulation, provided that the regulation there is some familiarity with the Toda protocol, with Algorand, other alternative systems. And then you say, well, if this is the new ecosystem, then let's regulate that. I would welcome informed regulation. I think it's going to be an engine of growth. And by the way, if we don't regulate and innovate and accept this in the United States, whoever accepts it is going to bypass us. We are going to be leapfrogged. And this will be very bad indeed for the world and ourselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Great. Let me see if there are any more questions in the room. Great. Thank you. Right up front.
Hey, so I have a question more about cryptography and some of the implementation of some of these algorithms, like zero-knowledge proofs, and the implementation in something like Zcash, making it more obfuscated on the blockchain to make it less easy to track. I was wondering if you think that this might, like something like Zcash or even Monero, might hinder regulation and know your customer and some of these other regulations that you guys were talking about.
So I believe that as a technologist, technology is not your enemy. Lack of information is our enemy. So if you tell us say we welcome this system, but I think we need to somehow strike a good balance between the needs of a government, of a collectivity, of society in general, and the individual. People think, oh, if it's cryptography, nobody can understand anything, or if this, we go from one extreme to another. What this technology is giving you a sliding ruler, the ability to bridge and making a very stable bridge at any point in between these two opposites. So we would love to have the regulator say, you know what, we can live with that. Can you deliver? And that is a very hard question to ask. Somebody ought to know a lot about cryptography and the power of technology to raise this question. Because to a first thinking seems impossible. So you have to choose between two evils, say, or two extremes. And to raise the question means that I've understood that actually in cyberspace, and in cryptographic cyberspace in particular, the impossible is actually doable. Because you can actually prove to somebody, you mentioned zero-knowledge proofs, that you know that something is true without telling them why. And very often the regulator only wants to know, is this true? So if you are investing, are a bank, and you are required to have a certain exposure to make sure that you are somehow solvable, that is, I think, is a good thing. But then who wants to volunteer how you invest your money, in which sectors, in which percentage? Then that is your proprietary thing. So you cannot, so either you refuse the regulation or you have to reveal your trade secrets. I think you can do both. So that is very important for the regulators, in particular for the person who spoke before, I don't know if he's still here or not, is that to know that actually if we ask, actually don't be afraid to ask the impossible questions, because chances are that the impossible is actually deliverable and in actually in better and more secure way that you may think.
Great, thank you.
To Silvio's point, just want to add one thing, and that goes back to privacy, which is the raison d'etre of our company. Privacy and security by design doesn't necessarily mean that you're hiding something to get something secure. It's actually the opposite. So when you go to bank or running certain transaction, the question that you're being asked is because they don't necessarily have the cryptography in place to secure a certain thing. But if they did have that, then they're asking the wrong questions. So when they're asking, where did you get that, money from, and prove this, prove that, perhaps they need to ask the question, is this legitimate or not? And if you're able to prove that this is legitimate money, that's all they need. And that's the idea that Silvio started with.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? One more? Two more? We have time.
Hi, I think we all look forward to that, like reaching the critical mass moment, right? Everyone collaborate and participate in that. But like think back, like in the financial service industry, back like 20, 25 years ago, there is a Bolario platform where all major banks like major sponsor to this whole thing, and everyone trusts it. But end up it never take off because actually no one's want to give up the existing revenue stream to paper-based processing and centralized like ledgers, right? So like, do you see this new wave of blockchain like development? Is it going to be like top-downs where like driven by the major banks like leading the projects, or is it going to be bottoms up? Okay, where is a rebellious movement, like people like really like in the detailed processing need this, and then driving from the bottom up to make the change?
So if the current blockchain deliver on the promise of the blockchain, it would have been here by now. Just so you know, because the bottom up, it's been happening for quite some time. The demand for cryptocurrency and all of that globally has been happening. $52 billion is in cryptocurrency today, over 1,000 blockchains. But we can look at it from the perspective that it's unfortunate that none of them they deliver on the promises of blockchain and dwell on that, or we can look at that into an opportunity of like, how can we deliver on the promises of blockchain and partake in a huge win in the global economy? And that's, I think, where we stand today. 1,000+ blockchains cannot deliver. How can we introduce blockchain that can deliver and benefit from that. And from ground up, top down, whichever way you look at it, when something that has the least amount of friction, its universal rule, it will end up making it to this universe. And this is happening.
But it's a fair question, and the important, because otherwise to say, I agree with Toufi, it's going to happen, but then says, why hasn't happened yet, right? So when is the critical mass? And the point is that there has been so far a technological hurdle, which is scalability. So so if a system does not scale, necessarily you reach saturation, and then after a while, somebody else has to do a different blockchain, which then will be reach saturation, and then he has to move on because it doesn't scale. So there is so many people you can serve, right? At a 7 transactions per second or 20 that may be. So only is a question so far of scalability. I don't believe right now that scalability is any longer a question with the right technologies. Toda protocol, Algorand, and if there is someone else, welcome to that too. But I'm saying now is the question is, can we now deliver? And I'm very optimistic. In terms of timing, I really believe that is going to be third world first, developing countries rather first, and then later. But we are going to find some microcosms, settlement systems that they need, because who wants to settle a transaction 3 days later? I mean, that is really archaic, right? So I think we are going to see movement in that type of space.
I agree. I think it's going to be both. There's going to be bottom up, and then there'll be visionary banks that'll help it along. So,
great. Did you have one more?
This is Dan Spooler with the Chamber of Digital Commerce. I'm curious to see the use cases we continue to hear every other month. It seems there's another use case that gets traction. We're hearing intellectual property, supply chain, financial services, of course. Where do you see the industry in 5 years, just from your expertise? I'm just curious to see where you think and which use cases do you think will be the ones that begin to get mass adoption.
So I personally still think that I don't know if I won't put a number of years to it, but in the near term, you will still in the financial industry see relatively small volume transaction type of use cases, like private equity or similar use cases where the volume of transactions are low, maybe high value, high friction areas. I still feel that you'll probably see private permission blockchains in the short term. Maybe 5 years might be that inflection point when you start to see that explosion, but nobody can say.
So according to the IMF, you can buy the entire planet for $1,400 trillion. So just to put things in perspective, in the current blockchain is about $52 billion, and that's because, like Silvio mentioned, and we've been watching it very closely, just because the technology area does not scale. Okay, so imagine if it did scale, it would have been here by now. It wouldn't be 52 billion. It would be close to 1,400 trillion. So I really think that in the next 5 years, we would be very close to having blockchain technology that it's that huge, that it's basically increasing the global value by at least $500 trillion. And when you say that, it might sound like too delusional or crazy, but when you really look at the numbers, 1,400 trillion is the price of the world, and this technology is going to disrupt and it's going to be able to enable folks that they don't have access to banking, and it becomes a bit more plausible, and that's the way I see it in the next 5 years.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank each of you and also the audience. So, Arijit, thank you for coming. Silvio as well. Appreciate it. And Toufi, really fantastic job. Let's give him a round of applause.